All right, well, we're jumping into the next part of our series here. Good news for hard heads, and I'm going to start with a story about Moses. All right, and so everyone say Moses. You guys are so good at this, man. This is like responsive. We're going to have a party today. So anyway, Moses in the Old Testament, there was this story that many of you know. He went up on Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments, right? You guys following so far, tracking? And when he came down, there was some interesting stuff, all right? And so first of all, he was going to make a speech, and he had note cards for his speech, and his note cards were on stone, right? So he had these big stone note cards of all the stuff he was going to say. Obviously, the 10 Commandments on the stone tablets. That joke was funnier in the first service. You guys just let me down. All right. They laughed. And his face was glowing. How many of you guys have heard that story? His face is glowing, right? And so God spoke to him. The physical glory of God affected his physical body in such a way that it became incandescent. It looked like one of those posters that you get from that one store in the mall, and you put it in your room, and right, it just glowed. It was crazy, and the people were scared, and they tried to run away, but he had to call them back, and he said, "No, I need to tell you what God told me." And so he relays all the information, and then he finishes talking, and he does like the reverse of a wedding. He has this veil, and he covers his face, right? And then he leaves it covered, and he walks away. And pretty quickly, what developed with the Israelites was a pattern of Moses with this veil. God would summon Moses, and he would go to this place called the Tent of Meeting, and he would meet with God, and God would speak to him on occasion. And it would be this crazy experience where he experienced God physically, and it would make his face glow. And so then he would come out, he would relay to the people what God had told him, and then he would cover his face with the veil, and he would go on living. And so that's this pattern: encounter with God, glowing face, deliver the message, cover up the face until the process restarts again at some point. It was a very mysterious thing, as you can imagine. Like, some of us feel like it's mysterious walking around with like just face masks on, right? Imagine if we just walked around veiled all the time. We'd look like a bunch of beekeepers or something. And so that's essentially what's happening with Moses, right? And it's such a strange thing. But in the book of 2 Corinthians, which we're just kind of teaching our way through 2 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians, Paul explains what's going on with the veil. So here's what's happening, and Paul gives us the insight, is that Moses is meeting with God, and his face begins glowing. His body is reflecting the glory of God, but Moses does not daily meet with God. This is not like an occurrence that just happens all the time. In fact, it's not even regular occurrence. It's not like every Friday or the second Thursday of the month or anything like that he can count on. He's just at the mercy of God. When God shows up at the tent, he goes in to meet with him, and sometimes that might happen, and it'll happen again in a week, and then it might be 6 months before God shows up to tell him something, and he's just at the mercy of God. But here's what's happening. It's like this spiritual gas gauge now lives on his face. So by looking at him, you can tell how long it's been since he's been with God. Right? And if it's been recent, then it's boop, right? It's just glowing, right? And as time goes by, it slowly gets more and more dull and more. So you can imagine the challenge, because Moses is the leader, but he's only the leader because he's the one that's hearing from God. Okay? That's his qualification to be the leader, is that he's hearing from God. So imagine the challenge of being the leader as your face fades, right? And you're like, "Hey guys, we should do this. This is the right thing to do." And they're looking at him. They got like a little chart where they can tell how bright he is. He's like, "I know he's only at 20%. I don't know if we can trust this," right? And so he's got this like visible gas gauge for God's presence in his life. And so it's hard to live that way. And so he just covers it so nobody knows at any given time how close to God he is, right? And so just kind of think about that. That's the reality of the situation, is that Moses had to mitigate the fading of the face because he wasn't in control of when he actually got to meet with God. He couldn't go, "I'm getting kind of dim. It's time to go back for another refill. And so that brings us to the problem we're going to talk about today, and that's this. Sometimes we live with a one and done spirituality or fading spirituality. And we'll get into what that means in a minute. But one thing we have to understand to start with is that Old Testament spirituality is very different than New Testament Christianity. If you look at your Bible, the way it went from Genesis to Malachi, it changed drastically at Matthew. And that's what we live in today, is the New Testament. And so it's very different than the way it functioned in the Old Testament, right? And so the biggest difference that sets it apart is that back then in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit, the physical presence of God, did not indwell people the way that he does now, right? So now we have terms for little things like in kids' church, we talk about asking Jesus in your heart, right? And all that kind of stuff. Well, really the reality is now when you put your faith in Jesus, God's presence, the Holy Spirit, it actually indwells us. And that's the reality that we now live with. So we physically can meet with God, commune with God. But Moses, he was the head of everything. He was closer to God than anybody else was at that time in the world. But yet he did not have the prerogative to interact with God whenever he felt like it. So Moses couldn't just be having a bad day and go spend time in the presence of God, right? That wasn't available. God called on him, met with him when God chose, and that's so different than what we have today, right? Christian spirituality is fundamentally different than that. We get to go to God when we want. God is here with us. He's interacting in us and through us. And so, but the truth is, honestly, at times, we function more like Moses, right? Sometimes we function more like this Old Testament picture where we maybe lunge forward in our closeness to God. Like we have this season, this event that happens, and it's like, boom, we get really close to God for some reason. Like, especially if you grew up, some of our young people, we grew up going to like youth camps. Some of you guys grew up going to like Christian summer camps. Go ahead and raise your hand. Yeah. And so what happens at those? Like you like, man, it's an intense time. You get close to God. And so you come out of that and you're like, boo, you're up here, right? And then by the time school comes, you're back down here, and then you survive for a while, and you go on a retreat, and then you're kind of back up here. But we have this thing where we lunge forward in closeness to God because of some event or some season of life, but then often that's followed by a slow drift, right? That's kind of what we do. We draw real close, and then we put it on cruise control for a while, or it slips into neutral, and we just cruise. We maybe surge forward in our obedience to God. Then something happens and it causes, how many of you guys ever, something went wrong and it caused you to realize you've gotten out of whack and you clean up your act all at once. You go around and you get some stuff in order. You go, man, my life has gotten out of whack in this area and this. And so you make all kinds of corrections. And so sometimes we do that. We go, I need to get this thing going, and you do it. But then maybe afterwards, instead of keeping that same pace or momentum, then you drift for a while. You go, okay, we did good for a while. Now we're just going to take it easy for a little while. Or maybe we learn some huge new thing. Maybe it's in a sermon, or maybe it's we read it in the Bible, we read a book somewhere, and it just really blows our mind, and it causes this huge surge forward in our knowledge of God and our understanding of life. But then maybe we plateau for a while, and we just kind of ride that thing out for another season. And that's so often how we live. And I kind of call this as my own term. This isn't like coined from the Bible or an actual theologian, right? This is what I call peak and valley spirituality. This is where we live in these series of good moments and then slow drift away from the good moments. And then it gets to an especially low point, and it motivates us in the low point to do something different, and then we have another spike. But if you think about that style, the spikes are fast and they go up sharply, but then the decline is super slow on the other side, right? And so if you think about that style of living, many of us are in decline far more than we're moving forward, right? So we surge forward, but then just, and so that's peak and valley spirituality. That's actually what Moses was living in, right? He would go into the tent, face glowing, right? All this stuff, and then, now the difference is Moses wasn't in control of when that would happen. And so that's peak and valley. But for some of us, it's not even as good as peak and valley, because some of us were actually raised in church traditions where it's like one and done spirituality, where basically there's some step that you take. You prayed a prayer, you went to an altar, you went through a class, you got baptized, whatever it was, you finished, they gave you a certificate, you're like, boom, this must be my ticket to heaven, I better put it somewhere safe, right? And so it's just a one and done. It's checking a box, and now I can move on and focus on other things in life. And again, this isn't like the fault of some of us. This is just what we were raised to believe was what Christianity was. It's accomplished once. It's kind of like getting a driver's license, right? You study really hard for the test, you take the test, and then you're in, and then you become, like, just gradually, like, how many of you guys are like, man, I'm not a good driver. If I had to retake that test, I would be in trouble, right? But I'm in. I'm good. I'm taken care of. And for so many of us, that's the way that we view spirituality. Even if it's subconscious, we don't plan for it to be that, but it ends up as that. And I'm here to tell you this morning that New Testament spirituality is meant to be so much better than that. It's meant to be so much more than that. And so that's why we're looking at what Paul said today in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We're just going to read a couple verses, verses 12 and 13. And he says this, therefore, since we have such a hope, we're very bold. So I'm going to interrupt him for a second, and I'm going to tell you what he's saying. He's saying, listen, because our system is different than Moses. He was talking about Moses right before he said this. Since we have a better system than Moses lived under, we can have boldness. Moses couldn't be bold. Moses couldn't walk into the tent of meeting and go, boom, baby, I'm here. Where you be, Jesus? Like, he couldn't do that. He couldn't invite God in and be like, hey, God, I'd like to talk to you. Could you come in here and catch up with me? That wasn't his prerogative, right? He was totally at the mercy of what happened. And so he's saying, listen, our hope is better than that. We get to be bold and come into God's presence ourselves. We can initiate. And so therefore, since we have such a hope, we're very bold. We are not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. Saying we don't have to live on the decline like that. We don't have to have the spikes and then the decline. We don't have to live with the glory of God always slowly trickling out, with the momentum running down. And so here's the point I want to make. We have been invited to boldly pursue more of God. We've been invited to boldly pursue more of God. Paul is telling us that our spiritual system is so much different than what Moses had, and it's so much better, right? We're not limited in the ways that Moses was limited. We can be very bold in our pursuit of God. You see, Moses was just at the mercy of whenever God happened, from his perspective, of whenever God happened to show up in that tent and invite him in. And that was the reason for the veil. That was the reason for the covering. Because as he felt it slipping, as he felt it drifting, there was nothing he could do to initiate a change in that. He couldn't invite himself into God's presence, so his plan was to mitigate it by covering up, by putting on the veil, right? By just kind of making do until some outside circumstance fixes it. And so as his face would fade, so would his revelation of God. So understand that. His face was like this visible thing of what was happening in his heart. As his face got dimmer, so did the sense of the closeness and the imminence of God in his life. Right? As his face faded, so did his memory of what it felt like to be so close to his Father in heaven. As his face faded, so did his assurance of what he knew God had told him to do. How many of you guys have ever felt that? You're like when you do have those moments where you're close to God and you're very sure of what you feel like God has led you to do. But then as more time passes between that event, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe he didn't say that. I don't know, maybe he said, well, maybe this isn't so bad after all, right? Isn't that usually how it works? It's like, yeah, maybe, well, maybe, I don't know. Maybe God didn't tell me to stop doing that. Maybe he just told me to stop for that day, right? Whatever it was, like our sureness and our clarity about what's next or what's required of us, it slowly fades. And again, I want you to see, like, we're not condemning Moses. Moses couldn't just freshen it up as he felt needed. He couldn't go, man, I'm feeling a little bit dry today spiritually. I need to go and spend some extra time. And guys, it wasn't up to him. And that's why what we have is so much better, because we can be bold. We're told here that our whole difference is that we get to be bold. How many of you guys have those friends that will ask you for things that stun you? Anybody? They're like so bold. They're like, it was pretty funny. One time I had this relative who had this really nice car. And I just assumed because everyone loves me that they would want me to borrow their super nice car. And so I called them. I'm like, hey, I was wanting to take my wife out of town for a special weekend. Can I borrow your Corvette? And it's like that moment, like, I can't believe this person asked me this. What am I going to say in response to this person? But luckily, he was comfortable telling me no. And so anyway, but do you have those people in your life? Like some people are like, hey, I need to ask you a huge favor. Can I borrow $1? And you're like, oh, of course, $1. Yeah. And then there's the friend that's like, hey, I need to ask a huge favor. I need $5,000 and I'm probably never going to be able to pay you back. What do you say? And they're like, well, I mean, I know you have it because I've looked at your bank account balance recently. And you're like, But the truth is, that's what he's telling us to be. He's telling us to be bold. He's telling us to ask for audacious things. He's telling us to want more from him than we're comfortable even asking for. We get to be bold. You see, rather than mitigate our fading revelation, a fading closeness to God, rather than covering up and keeping people from seeing it, rather than mitigating it, we get to go get fresh revelation. And so we do that lots of ways. That's why we worship together every week. Some of you guys may not even understand that. Like, why do these Christians get together and sing songs? It's so weird, right? It's like, man, as we begin to worship, something happens. God's presence shows up in the middle of that, and we have a revelation of him. And if we were like Moses, our face would go bing and begin to glow again. We get that fresh connection with him. And so you can do that in worship. You can do that in service and worship. You know what? There's this thing called the internet now. You can have worship time anywhere. Like on a Wednesday morning on YouTube, you can put it on, whatever else, right? And so there's these moments that we can have in God's presence. You do this through seasons and times of prayer. Like, I encourage you, if you don't have a daily time that you're reading the scriptures and praying, establish that. That's why as a church, we have a group that's all working through the YouVersion Bible app. It's a Grace Union group, and there's a link on our website. There's a link always on our Facebook page. You can click that. It invites you into our group, and then you're reading the same scriptures that we're reading every day. You get to comment on them and read the comments of others. We can be there with each other. It's a really neat thing. And so I encourage you, that's how you experience the revelation of God, through his word, through times in prayer, right? And then sometimes, again, it's not just those daily practices, it's entering into special seasons of it. Like there was a time as a church where we did this thing where the first few seconds of every hour you're supposed to think about God. So I mean, you could decide next week, I'm going to do a season of prayer, and for the first 2 minutes of every hour that I'm awake, I'm just going to pray extra. Right? Just little things like that. That's how you dive further back in to God's presence and you experience him. And so reading books, digging into church teaching, all that kind of stuff is how we stay connected to God, stay in his presence and keep growing. Hebrews 4:16 talks about it like this. It says, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence. Some translations use the same word as the Corinthians verse there, boldness. Let us then approach God's throne with confidence, with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. I love what that verse is saying, right? He's saying, listen, we can be bold coming into God's presence. He's saying we can have confidence. We can have boldness. We can be audacious about coming into God's presence. And here's why. Because he wants us to be that way. Isn't that crazy? He's inviting us. That's like if you have a bunch and you invite that bold friend and say, go ahead, ask me for anything. Well, that might be a scary proposal, right? If you know this person's already bold and you invite them to be more bold and say, ask me for anything, and the answer is going to be yes. But that's essentially what God is saying here. It's like, be bold. As much as you want of me is going to be available for you. As hard as you chase me, you're going to continue to find me. He's inviting us to be bold. You know, I've heard it said that the only difference between being highly romantic and persistent in the pursuit of somebody and being a stalker is just being able to tell if they like you back. Right? That's the only difference. Right? If you really pursue somebody and you cut up their tennis shoes and send them to them in the mail, they're going to think that's so no, you're going to go to jail for that, right? But there's all these little persistent things like, oh, here's a ketchup packet from the table the first time I viewed you from across the room or through the binoculars or whatever it is, right? That stuff, if they like you back, it's super sweet. But if they don't, you're going to jail, right? That's how it works. The whole difference is knowing, does the person want me to pursue them? The difference between romance and stalking is whether or not they like you back. And that's the point I'm making, is that God tells us to pursue him. He tells us to be bold in our pursuit. And he goes so far as to even tell us what his response is going to be. He's like, listen, you're going to ask the question, and the answer is going to be yes. How many of you guys wish your wife would have done that the first time you asked her out? If she would have said, here's the question. The question is, will you go out with me? And the answer is yes. Right? We're like, okay, will you go out with me? Yes, thank you. Right? I mean, that's what he's doing. He's giving us the question and the answer. Right? I mean, if this were a date, God would be like, hey, this would be a good time to ask for a kiss. Right? Like he's telegraphing. He's letting you know, if you look for me, you're going to find me. I'm going to be here to meet you. And so no matter what that thing is that you need, is it mercy? Man, so many of us, all of us, we fail. And you might be in a spot right now this morning where you go, man, what I need from God is an assurance of his mercy. I'm so afraid that if I trust, I'm so afraid that if I draw near, I'm so afraid that if I go to a church, I'm not going to be accepted. I'm not going to be embraced. I'm so afraid that if I even care about God, that I'm just too far gone, and I'm just going to open myself up for rejection. But he tells us, if you come to me, you're going to find mercy. He's already told you his response. Grace is unmerited favor. That means just continuing to give and give and give even when you don't deserve, can't earn, can't ever repay. And so he's already told you, if you're bold in your pursuit of me, you're going to find grace. I'm going to give you more than you deserve, more than you can earn, more than you could ever justify. I'm going to give you mercy. I'm going to give you grace. And then he even rounds it all out by just saying, and help in your time of need. Whatever it is that you need help with, if you boldly pursue me, he says, this is what I'm going to give you. Isn't that so comforting to know? Man, there's so many times where I feel like I've just blown it too much now. I've failed too much. Or maybe I've been too disinterested. Right? Maybe you don't even feel like an especially big failure like me. You just feel like I just haven't been interested enough in Jesus. Well, how do I know he's going to be interested in me now that I come looking to him after all these years of ignoring him? Because he's told you, pursue me, and you're going to find mercy, you're going to find grace, you're going to find help in your time of need. And so using Moses as an example, remembering what he went through and what he did, his face would glow, the glowing would begin to fade. He would cover it with a veil. So using that as an example for our lives, just begin to ask yourself, are there areas in my life and in my spirituality where the glow associated with God's presence might be fading? Like, am I on the fade, right? Am I slowly creeping down? Has there been a peak that I'm kind of living off of for way too long now? Like in general, just intimacy and closeness with God. Like, can I remember back to when I really felt like God and I were close? And is there distance in this relationship now? Am I fading? Have I put on the veil because there's a fade in that area? In areas of obedience and self-discipline, maybe there was a time when you really did have your stuff together, man, and you were like, hey, I know there's grace, but I'm not just going to hog it all. Like, and some of us are like, yeah, I know there's grace, and I'm putting it to good work in my life, right? And so like maybe I'm just kind of sitting back and coasting now. I used to be serious about honoring God with my life and the way that I live. But maybe I'm drifting from that. Maybe there's a fade going on in that area. Maybe it's just in my general attitudes and the disposition of my heart. Is there a fade going on there? And I just love how Paul assures us. He says it doesn't have to fade. It wasn't intended to be a continually fading reality. The closeness, the passion, the fervor, it doesn't have to bottom out. You see, sometimes our problem is that we're waiting for God to just show up like a tornado and move us, right? Isn't that kind of what we do? We're like, and eventually God is merciful and he'll like move you, but it's usually by smacking you with something, right? Like the tornado's going on and he doesn't move you. He just lets like the truck blow by and hit you on its way by. And you're like, oh, God, I'm sorry, I'll get it right. And so we're waiting for God to be this force that just moves us automatically and overwhelms us and does in us what we need him to do. But he invites us. That's what he does. He invites us to boldly pursue him and to get from him what we need. He wants us to be driving this ship. He wants you to want him the same way that he wants you. He's moved heaven and earth to know you. Will you boldly pursue him? You see, no matter where you are or how faded you feel like your spirituality may be, he's already told you what his response is going to be to you. Isn't that remarkable? No matter how much shame you might be carrying because of what you've done or where you've been or where you haven't been, he's already told you his response. It's going to be mercy. It's going to be grace. And it's going to be help in your time of need. You see, guys, God has something for us that is far better than peaks and valleys. New Testament spirituality was always meant to be more than that, better than that. So 2 Corinthians, we're going to finish Paul's thought here as we start to get close to being done here. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 17 and 18, it says, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So he's telling us something. He's saying, listen, God doesn't show up in a tent anymore. Now he's put his Spirit in our hearts and our lives. So there's freedom to encounter him anywhere, anytime. Right? And so now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, I want you to notice that, we all, not just the leader, not just the Moses, not just the people on stage who get to meet with Jesus, not just all of those people, right? We all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory. Here's what he says is happening to us. We're being transformed into his image with an ever-increasing glory. He's directly referencing Moses' experience. He's saying Moses' glory and the expression of God's glory in him was ever decreasing. It would get established and then it would leak. God's plan for you is an ever increasing glory as you grow more and more in the image of his Son, Jesus. You see, guys, there's no special place for us to go to anymore like Moses had to go to. Like, we're here in a building, but I want to tell you something. God's here today because you're here. He came with you, right? Scripture says where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with them. right? Because God's Spirit lives in. That's why it's so fun to gather. That's why we're so glad to be back from quarantine and all of that, because when we gather, there's actually the deposit of God's Spirit that came with you and came with you and came with you and came with you. And so I get to experience that and encounter that. And it's so much more fun than just me and Karen in front of the TV, right? And so that's great, but that's why we gather, because we bring the presence of God. He lives in us. And so that's why he's saying there's no special place. That's why right now there's people watching on the TV and they're experiencing the Holy Spirit there. It's so incredible, right? God brings his Spirit to us now. And so there's freedom to encounter him. And then there's no special people, right? That God just only speaks to them or speaks to them more or wants to speak to them more than he wants to speak to you. We all get to behold the Lord's glory. And then I love this cool part. He says our faces are unveiled. Because this spirituality isn't limited to peaks and valleys. Because this isn't supposed to be forever fading and declining. It's not intended to be a one and done thing. So there's no more need to have to veil it. There's no more need for us to just sit back and wait for something to happen to us. We're invited to be bold and go chase after him ourselves and live in this forever increasing glory. You see, verse 18 even goes as far as to say that God transforms us in an ever increasing way. You see, this isn't like this thing where it's like, well, I was terrible and then I became a believer and then I just became less terrible and someday Jesus is going to come back and that's the next change and the final change I'm waiting on. He's saying, listen, if you'll stick with this, God will be revealed in your life in an ever increasing way. Maybe you'll get a little bit better with your temper, and then a little better with your temper, and then eventually the freedom that you're getting there is going to begin spilling into other parts of your lives as well. And then you're growing in honesty, you're growing in integrity, you're growing in your parenting and in your marriage and on your job and in your friendships. And what's happening is more and more you're becoming a display of God's own image that he's deposited in you through the Spirit that's now fleshing itself out in your life, right? And that's what he's saying, an ever-increasing glory. And here's how that happens. I want to invite the band to start to get in place as we're going to finish here in a second. He says that we do this with unveiled faces as we contemplate the Lord's glory. And so this an interesting word here, contemplation. You see, contemplation as it's being used here is painting a picture of deliberately and continually re-engaging with something. And so I want you to think for just a second, and I'm not going to preach this to you, I'm going to let you preach this concept to yourself internally. So I want you to think about what is the difference between having a thought and contemplating. Just for a minute, just dwell on that. What are the differences between having a thought and contemplating? It's pretty profound, the difference between the two. And he's saying that should be the difference between the kind of spirituality that we sometimes live in and what he's really inviting us into. This isn't like this thought that comes and this experience that happens and passes and then we just live off of it. It's contemplation. It's coming back to it, and it's coming back to it, and it's coming back to it, and it's dwelling on it from a different angle, and it's dwelling on it from a different angle, and it's bringing it back up and chewing on it some more. Now, how many of you guys know you don't really get the good out of any thought until you've contemplated it? The longer you contemplate a concept, the more you really get the good stuff come to the surface. You got to really chew on it for a while to really get the good stuff out. And that's the difference. That's what he wants. You don't have to live off of yesterday's spirituality or last week's or last month's or last year's, or for some of it's even longer. There's this point a long time ago in our lives when we were really spiritual, when we were really close to God, and now we're just hoping that he's got grace for us and where we are. And he does have grace, but he's also got so much more. You see, God's glory shining through your life can be ever increasing. And not only can it be, it's his plan to make it that way. I get so excited because I see this as a reality in our people all the time. and I talk to someone and they make this huge life change and this decision, and then a month goes by, and that's the fun part of being a pastor, is like you really get to know people, but sometimes you don't get to talk to everybody every single week. And so you see somebody, you really connect with them, you hear what's going on in their life, and then it might be a month or two, and then all of a sudden you're in another environment where you're talking and you're like, oh my goodness, here's where you were when I saw you 2 months ago and really talked. And now there's this. And now I see you a year later and now you're here. And then we talk about this later. And there's this ever increasing glory as I watch character change, as I watch abilities change, as I watch interests change, as I watch just the closeness and the assurance of their relationship with the eternal God, as I watch that change. Because that's always been his plan for New Testament spirituality. And so here's what I want to challenge you to do today, is don't settle for the veil. Don't settle for the veil. Don't settle for mitigating a fading spirituality. He's invited you to be bold. He's told you that when you're bold in your pursuit of him, he's already told you his response. He's told you you're going to be met with mercy and with grace and with help. So boldly pursue. And when it comes to God, be that friend. Be that friend, that one that you're afraid to ask, can I help you with something? Because you don't know what you're going to hear. Be that person in your relationship with God. Be bold in your pursuit of Jesus. Be bold in your pursuit of the Spirit. See what he's going to say in your life, and let this not be the end of it. Let this be the thing that starts a new pace for you this next week, guys. And so God bless you. For my part, have a great week. We'll see you guys later.